Okay. Hello to everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. I am Christopher Carlson, and I'm here in Nairobi, from where we, Small Arms Service, coordinate a number of our projects in the Horn and the East Africa region. One of those is the Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan. An initiative that falls within the Human Security Baseline Assessment for Sudan and South Sudan, or perhaps no more familiarly with its acronym HSBA project. Most of you here are registered users of the Mapping Project website, and so you're familiar with what that is, and I hope you're finding it useful in the work that you're doing in South Sudan. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to see the map, we will provide a link for you in the chat box. And through that URL, you can set up a username for yourself, very easy process, and gain access to the Actors Mapping website. The Mapping Actors and Alliances project in South Sudan is an online database providing a who is who among the over 500 individual actors, armed groups, and political parties in South Sudan. This database is updated daily to provide users with current information on actors across all 10 states and down to county levels. If you're not registered on the site, please do so. And if you have any problems, we are happy to help you out. There's a web address, and I'll make sure that I put the panelists, the speakers today, their email addresses in the chat box so that you can follow up as needed with any of us if you've got any questions or technical concerns trying to log into the website. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of unity state. We most recently produced what we're calling actors updates. These are brief analytical pieces that are put together and issued and have been issued over the last year, starting in last February with ministerial appointments. Since then, we've had updates covering governorships as well as commissioner appointments. Other updates will be coming along in the future. We'll have another out in the middle of April looking at Jonglei State and some of the conflict dynamics and security dynamics that are going on there. We'll follow that actors update with another webinar at the end of this month, and that will focus on Jonglei. But for today, our topic is unity state. For those of you who received the invite for this webinar, I hope you were able to download the update, the actors update on Unity that was provided earlier last week, which will serve as the basis for today's discussion. Allow me to introduce who will be discussing Unity today, my two colleagues with the MAAPSS project. One of them is Joshua Craze. Joshua Craze is a longtime HSBA contributor and has written extensively on unity state in South Sudan more generally. Some of his publications include A State of Disunity, Conflict Dynamics in Unity State from 2013-2015, and Legitimacy, Exclusion, Power, Taban Dengai, and the Future of the South Sudan Peace Process. Along with Joshua will be Ferry Marco, Small Arms Survey and HSBA researcher. Both Joshua and Ferry have been immersed most recently in Unity and Jonglei research. And so I'm looking forward to both this discussion that they will have today and a discussion in a webinar that will come up at the end of the month. And for that webinar on Jonglei, we will also be inviting two guest speakers, one from the World Food Program and the other a South Sudanese Jonglei researcher. So I hope that everyone here is able to join us for that. I will be sending out some details concerning that webinar when we send out that actor update in a couple of weeks' time, providing you with the date and time for that webinar. But please expect that that will happen probably the last Thursday of April. Just one final note before I hand things over to my colleagues, and that is that we will be recording the discussion that Ferry and Joshua will be having right now. And then we will close that recording as we open up the floor for questions from you following this discussion. So thank you again for joining us. And Ferry, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christopher. So the format today will be that it will be mostly Joshua who will be speaking about Unity State. And I prepared several questions of why I think that, and what are the details that we should look at in Unity State. So we try to make it more of a dialogue than just Joshua speaking. He did most of the research through research assistants, and he has ample experience in Unity State, publishing several huge reports, partially for Small Arms Survey, partially for other places, other organizations. And so my first question, just to situate Unity State that you can see on the map, is, Joshua, why does it matter? Why does Unity State matters from the 10 states and 3 administrative areas?
Thanks, Ferry. I mean, just to say one thing about these webinars, one of the things that we thought about them, the way that they function, is just provide an introduction. So if people are going into the field, if they're being deployed to Bentiu, for instance, they could listen to this and it's like, this is the politics of Unity in 1 hour. Here's everything you need to know in a granular or a podcast form, and in a way that you won't get from a report, for instance. So like, these are going to be for every state. We're going to do one for Warab, we're going to do one for Northern Bahr Ghazal. And so if you have staff or if you have people you think would benefit, then please send a link or sign up. So why does Unity State matter? Now, given that Ruweng has become its own administrative area, look forward to that webinar in the near future, Unity is the only monoethnic Nuer area. It's also, of course, the home place of Riek Machar, it's the home place of Taban Dengai. It's something of a bellwether, basically, for the IO. So by looking at Unity, one gets a sense of the strength and the situation of the opposition. Then during the Second Civil War, Unity, I think, both formally and substantively was sort of the epicenter of what happened. And what do I mean by that distinction? I mean that formally what you see in Unity is, of course, the government in Khartoum backing Nuer militias, most notoriously those of Bul Nuer. And those militias displaced populations, they controlled the oil fields, and they militarized raiding. So what you had was customary forms of violence, like raiding between sections, raiding between youth, as we're used to, being instrumentalized by a military in the north for political, like nation-state-based objectives. And that development, that instrumentalization of raiding and of customary forms of violence becomes very much the logic of the current civil war. And that development happens in Bahr Ghazal, but really you see it happening in Unity. So that's formally why Unity during the Second Civil War is really important. But then I think substantively, the question of Unity during the Second Civil War is still the question that we're living with during the current conflict, which is to say that at the end of the Second Civil War in 2005, of course, the most important military force in South Sudan is not the SPLA, is not the army, which is currently now the SSPDF, it's Bul Nuer militias. And the question is, during this framework in which it was basically a negotiation between two parties, the government in Khartoum and the SPLA, what would be done with Bul Nuer militias? And the answer, of course, was the Juba Declaration. And what is the Juba Declaration? The Juba Declaration was the wholesale absorption of Nuer militias into the SPLA. What that enabled, what it afforded, was peace in Southern Sudan, relative peace. We can talk about how complicated that peace was from 2005 to 2011, but at the cost of effectively destroying what little sort of hierarchy and organization there was in the SPLA, and effectively turning it into a bidding war in which the Matep's militias were included within it only on the basis that they'd be rewarded with ranks and salaries. And that set up the sort of the oil-based competition that Alex Duval writes about so much, which of course implodes. And when the war begins in 2013, who are all the IO generals? Well, they're all Bul Nuer generals. right? They're all the figures that were absorbed during the Juba Declaration. They Peter Gadet, they get Quoth. So in a real sense, this war begins with the unanswered question of how to create a unified country with unity state in it. Now, of course, the conflict has changed since then in terms of who the main actors are and how the war is constituted. But I think really one understands from unity the beginning of this war. And in some ways, by looking at it, I think one needs to look at unity to understand how it might end. Thanks, very.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I try to find the unmute button. Okay. I get the point. We get the point. Why does it matter? So we can get into the details of two important families. They are related to the governor and his deputy and how they work together. So maybe you can tell us a bit about the current governor, Gwen Montiel, and who is he, and maybe about his deputy. And then we can see the entire unity state politics down to the county levels based on this relationship.
Sure. So Nguyen Montoy is Bul Nuer. He's from Mayom. He's the son of Montoy Wejang, who was one of the most important paramount chiefs. And so Nguyen illustrates a development that you see across much of southern Sudan, which is that figures who were the sons of customary authorities have reinvented themselves either as powerful traders, powerful military leaders, or in Nguyen's case, as a powerful politician. Another thing that's important to know about Nguyen is, of course, that he's backed by Pulino Matiep. So that legacy of the Second Civil War is very much alive today. And he's sponsored by Matiep to go to Khartoum to study. And then he becomes a doctor. He becomes Matiep's personal doctor for a while. During the current clashes that you see in unity very much have their origin, not just in their form, but in their substance during the Second Civil War. So in 1997 already, there's a competition for who's going to get to be the NCP, the Sudan-backed governor of Unity State. And the competition is between Paul Lilly, who's Matiep's candidate, and Taban Dengai. Taban Dengai prevails, Nguyen backs Lilly. So already there's this antagonism between Taban Dengai and Nguyen, and you see this antagonism repeated again in 2008, when there's going to be a gubernatorial election in 2010. Nguyen wants to stand, and he's blocked by the SPLM in Juba, and because he's blocked, it ends up being Angelina Teny, Mashar's wife, who takes the stand, as it were, against Taban Dengai. But what you see instead is he's sort of this enduring antagonism between the two figures. And what happens after 2010 is Taban Dengai basically goes to war against the Bul Nuer in Mayom. He begins a demilitarization campaign, which is a pacification campaign, which is code for a sort of form of warfare disguised as disarmament, which burns down villages, displaces the Bul Nuer. He attempts to assassinate Matthew Puljang, another important leader that we'll come to shortly. And that drives the Bul Nuer into rebellion. So Bapin Montoy, who is Nguyen's brother, who spent the Second Civil War also, wait 1 second. Bapin spent the war with SAF, coordinating efforts between Pulino Matiep and the militia, whereas and so he becomes the military force, whereas his brother is the political force. During the 2010 rebellions, what happens is he takes over relationships with Khartoum, and they start to fight against Taban Dengai, backed by Khartoum, who sees in this the possibility of disrupting the 2011 referendum. And you have this fight. In 2013, when the war breaks out, then Nguyen sees the possibility of displacing Taban Dengai. And insofar as he can displace him, he sides with the government rather than the rest of the Bul Nuer, who side with the opposition and with the SPLA-IO. So it's seen from the perspective of unity state, the siding with the government in 2013 is not substantive. It's not because there's some sort of strange loyalty to Salva Kiir's project. It's a way to displace Taban Gai, and the government is instrumental for Ngwen in much the same way as Ngwen and Puljang and the militias are instrumental for Kiir in being able to displace the IO from unity state. So really, if you look back at what Matep's legacy is, if during the Second Civil War, then Matep instrumentalized Khartoum to achieve Bul Nuer dominance of unity state, then today during the current civil war, Ngwen has instrumentalized Juba to again achieve Bul Nuer dominance of unity state. And it's Juba that is now playing the role of Khartoum. And just one final thing to say about Ngwen, there's much that's sort of made of the difference between SOA and OP and the IO and the government. But I think like one has to understand, and unity is a very good place to understand it, that a lot of those oppositions are purely formal, and they're done to maximize control of political systems because the political systems themselves are structured on the opposition between groups. And I think a really good case of that is, of course, Ngwen and Bapin. Bapin is in SOA, right? He supposedly left the government side over objections to the 28 States Decree and the way that parts of what is now Ruang Administrative State lops off supposedly bits of Mayom County. That's nonsense. There is a disagreement between Bapin and Ngwen, and that disagreement is lodged in what happened after the 2015 campaign. For those of you who don't remember it or who weren't around, in 2015, Bul Nuer militias swept down through Southern Unity with the backing of the government, committing mass displacement of people, stealing humanitarian aid, stealing cattle, whole-scale sexual crimes. And that was initiated by Kiir, and the people he asked to implement it were Bapin and Ngwen, and they fell out over payments for that militia movement. And that's why he left. But they then reconciled, and Bapin remained outside of the government because now he has a seat in SOA. And as he has a seat in SOA, his men can claim all the SOA positions, even though he's in alliance with his brother. So far too much attention is paid to these divisions between, for instance, SOA and the government, and not enough to the real substantive links of kinship and political power underneath them. And I think I'll come on to them when Ferry asks about the state level government in unity. I'll come on to other families which have the same relationship to these factional divisions.
Yes, thanks. So if I understand correctly, there's this Bentiu family who basically shared their loyalties between SOA, so formerly an opposition, and the government, and that's for them how they control unity state. And maybe if you talk about what happened now in 2021 when they appointed the unity state government, how that plays out also in other parts of the opposition government, imaginary sphere, or these spheres. So what happened in 2021? What is the new government in unity state?
Sure. So let's go through the government appointments quickly and then the IO appointments. I think there's three general trends to all the government appointments in unity state. One, a lot of them are figures who, surprise, surprise, used to work for Bul Nuer during the Second Civil War. I mean, it is the inheritance of Matip's infrastructure and Matip's commanders that we're seeing throughout unity state. That is the enduring legacy. And of course, Matip's legacy itself is contested. Peter Gadet for a while thought he'd be Bul Nuer. As it turns out, it's Ngwen Montoy. So a figure like that, for instance, is Stephen Salam Malouit, who is the beautifully named Unity State Advisor for Peace and Security. He was one of Matip's most trusted commanders, and he was responsible for Ripkona County. He was responsible for widespread displacement of people through the region. Another of those commanders was John Bul Maik. John Bul Maik is also Bul Nuer. And he was also one of Matep's commanders. He's now the police commissioner. John Bul Maik is important because during the current war, he was responsible for the recruitment of the Tershwang militia. These were the Bul Nuer militias I just mentioned that went through Southern Unity in 2015. And so one of the great ironies about John Bul Nuer is that he is now the police commissioner. Of course, he is now responsible for the care and protection of the people who were formerly housed in the Unrest POC. So the person who destroyed the villages and stole the cattle of the people who then fled into the Unrest POC is now responsible for their care and protection, which is part of the reason for the massive disquiet of the Southern Unity, so the people of Southern Unity and of Rukona, who now find themselves without Unrest protection. So one thing that's happened, Matiep figures have continued to be in power. Another is that Nguyen's made a series of very canny appointments designed to ward off any possibility of Taban Dengai reasserting himself into politics in Unity State. So for instance, the Unity State Advisor for Legal Affairs, Saman Dakota Shwatnir, is a very popular Jikani Nur from Gweet County, which is of course where Taban Dengai is from, and he's an important counterbalance against Taban Dengai among the Jikani Nur. So Nguyen's been trying to appoint figures that are popular enough to ward off Taban Dengai reasserting himself in Gweet County. Then the other third sort of tendency among government appointments is that they've been appointing figures from the Tungvar family. So the Tungvar family are sons of a very popular paramount chief, Tungvar Kwenongret. And so again, we have another like sons of paramount chiefs. There are two very important brothers. One is the government minister for housing, land and public utilities, which is an important position if we remember all the land issues that have been produced by the wholesale displacement of people during the current civil war. But also the deputy governor himself, Tor Tungwar, his brother, is IO. But of course, he's not really IO in any substantive sense. What they indicate, the sort of the unity of these two brothers, is an emergent Lake Nuer and Bul Nuer pact expressed to these powerful royal families, effectively, the families who are both the sons of kings. It's like a South Sudanese episode of The Crown. And both families spread their members across multiple sectors. So they're in the IO, they're in the government, but they're also in the NGO sector. They're also in the humanitarian sector. One of the sisters of Tortungwara, of course, married Nguyen Montoi, formally joining the two families together in a sort of royal pact. And I think for people working in NGOs in Unity State, maybe this is all known, but if it's not known, I would sort of urge and emphasize, like, know the families of the people you're engaging with. Learn, like, work out the logic of the actual politics in the places in Unity you're in. Otherwise, you're not understanding what you're doing or who you're engaging with, because actually these substantive kinship connections are far more important than whether someone happens to be or not the Minister of Labour and Public Services, a position that's basically not funded and has no meaningful policy implementations. So that's the government positions. Three things: Matiep figures, trying to ward off Taban Dengai, and creating alliances across ranks with the Tungvar family. The IO figures are interesting in terms of who they've appointed, because they're not actually the major IO figures in Unity State. So Simon McGregor Guy, who's been the sector commander for Sector 2 in Unity for the IO, has not got a position. And and that's astonishing, because not only have the IO figures who are popular on the ground not got positions, but even McGregor Guy, who was already unpopular, already thought of as a nepotistic appointment by Machar, is a relative of Machar, already blamed by the ground level IO for failing to hold Southern Unity, but who has some support. Even a figure like that hasn't been given a position of political power. Instead, the people given positions of political power are almost entirely figures close to Nguyen Montoi, which indicates to you the weakness of the IO in Unity State. Basically, the government has come in and made the IO's appointments for them. And so, like, a classic sort of case of that would be Nyakuma Abdallah Gai Dwop, who is the Minister of Labour and Public Services, who's also Bul Nuer, amazing preponderance of Bul Nuer in this cabinet. And she was appointed, she's an IO appointment, but she's just very close to Nguyen Montoi and of course to the Deputy Governor Tor Tungwar. So you have these very, they're appointments which are based on nepotism, they're weak figures who Machar thinks that he can control, and they're appointed because they're not designed to give any, to make Nguyen angry. They're basically confirming the total dominance of this Lake Nuer, Bul Nuer familial alliance at the top of politics in unity.
So, okay, so before we look into case studies, which will be Panjshir County, where does this leave SPLA-IO? What is the state of IO? IO, I mean, unity was the stronghold of IO. No, militarily, it was the stronghold. Several of the counties were never captured by the government. So what is the state of IO? What is the state of IO military? And how do you see the future of all this? If Riek Machar only appointed people close to him and people close to Montiel who they can control.
Well, so if I just talk briefly about Panjshir, then I'll be in a good place to come back to talking about the IO, because I think what we've seen really in Panjshir and in the other county commissioner appointments that the IO has made is exemplary of the IO's loss of control. So in Panjshir, the customary authorities had supported Justin Machien, who was the old commissioner of Panjshir, and the IO or Machar blocked Machien because he was thought to be too popular and to be too independent of Machar. And so they then said, okay, no Machien, we're going to support Michael Lokgat Luwak. Machar again ignored the recommendations of both the customary authorities in Panjshir and the Gojam and the White Army local organized militias, and he chose one of his former bodyguards, William Giak Mabor. And Mabor is not liked in Panjshir. He's felt like he's a figure who's remote from the community's concerns. They really like the IO leader in Panjshir, John Tap Puat Kang. And basically, they immediately, after Mabor was selected, they warned Machar and said, look, he can be commissioner, but he's not coming to Panjshir. He's not having any power here. He can be a commissioner in Juba. That's what they literally said to him. So this has a number of implications for Panjshir, but also for the other counties where the IO has power, which is to say that the IO county commissioners are not going to be able to stop raiding, which has been pretty bad in Mayandit and in Panjshir recently, is not going to be able to stop or influence any control on the Gojam, because for the local youth militias basically feel, you've abandoned us, you are nepotistic, you're only interested in power in Juba, you're entirely subservient to the government because you're dependent on Kiir's benevolence for whatever scraps he flings from his table for you in Juba. You're not able to intervene when we're raided by government forces or by Dinka forces from surrounding areas. We have nothing to give you. One of the interesting things about doing research in these places recently is to see all the ways in which the IO asked people for money and taxed them during the war. And the people felt that money just vanished. It vanished into Machar's pockets or to Bandengai's pockets when Bandengai was part of the mainline IO. So what we have really is the line between the government and the IO becoming increasingly thin. And figures like Mabor will sit in Juba and effectively be, and I have to use this word, a Potemkin leader who has no real control on the ground and is as sort of isolated and as fictional as the government leaders of a place like Panyakan in Upper Nile, right? Entirely opposition-dominated areas that have a sort of government figurehead in place who has no control. And I think what's also then difficult about that is that Southern Unity is not going to thus support the government. It's not going to stop being opposition, but it's going to be opposition without an opposition, right? It's going to be opposition without any sort of figurehead or any political representation. And that's pretty dangerous for the amount of violence that can produce.
And do you think this is related to this interesting proposal that the Bul Nuer had, that Panjshir should get its own GPAA, it should its own administrative area like Ruveng and Abyei, and do you connect that request from the community to this national level politics that you were just describing?
Right, I think that's a really good point, Ferry, and I think that links with what we saw when we were doing fieldwork in Jonglei, which is that the collapse of the opposition, and let's say all the oppositions really, in being able to offer substantive representation, support, meaningful political leadership to communities, is part of the reason that what we see is communities becoming increasingly ethnicized in their desires for political power. Like basically everywhere you go in South Sudan now, the Low Nuer want their own administrative area, the Nuong Nuer want their own administrative area, the people of Mayom want their own administrative area. And that produces far more ethnicized conflict, and it produces a zero-sum game where everyone is trying to compete for instance, county commissionership positions, such that they become like explicitly ethnicized positions. And so what we've seen, from 2005 is not that the country's becoming less ethnic, as it were, but more so. And that the project of nationalism has produced is not more nationalism, but more ethnicity and more sectional identity.
Maybe we can talk about two case studies or two persons who raised eyebrows all across the humanitarian community, as well as even in the UN system. Two persons who are responsible for violence in the past and who has interesting histories, the new commissioners, incoming commissioners of Koch and Lear. So maybe we can start with Lear country and Stefan Takariak, if you can talk a bit about him.
Sure, absolutely, Ferry. So if the IO appointments for commissioners are characterized by being basically nepotistic figures close to Mashar who are weak on the ground and thus cannot be a significant power that threatens Mashar, so he chooses figures which are alienated, weak, and he can keep under control. There's something of a similar pattern actually among the government, in that what the government's done effectively in sort of opposition areas is reappoint wartime commanders. And I think this indicates the degree to which the current peace really is just a continuation of the logic of the civil war, that there's no real change in the logic of governance across any of the opposition areas. So in Leer, you have the reappointment of Stefan Takker. Stefan Takker was a trader. He's a Bul Nuer from Leer. He was a trader who was appointed as a commissioner by Taban Dengai, massively unpopular, so unpopular and full of so much corruption that even Taban Dengai dismissed him for being corrupt, which takes some doing. He then, during the beginning of the civil war in 2014 to 2015, was responsible for some of the worst violence in Leer. He led the government forces against the local forces, and his captains burned down the territory of the Bul Nuer, so burned down his own ethnic group. He has no popular support. In 2014, he tried to mobilize a militia amongst his own family and failed. So he's really a figure who has been imposed from outside. And the reason for that is that he basically becomes a sort of a military occupying force. He's structurally equivalent to American troops in Iraq, right? That's his role. He's hated by the local population, or rather not even American troops in Iraq, but sort of like the initial Iraqi pigeons who came in to control at the behest of the American controlling forces. So the IO is largely still in control of the majority of the territory. So Chapkwai Dwar is the Leer IO commissioner, and he remains in large control of the territory. And Takker becomes a figure who basically sits as an occupying force. I think, though, on the other hand, that the humanitarian concern about the return of Stefan Takker is a bit overblown. Takker is entirely serving at the whim of Nguyen, and he won't do anything other than tax cattle, occasionally launch attacks on people who seemingly for him threaten his power, and raid. And of course, those things aren't great, but they're not the 2014 campaign. The reason he won't do that is that he serves at the behest of Nguyen and won't do anything without Nguyen. And for the moment, Nguyen has little interest in once again pillaging in Southern Unity, because there's very little left to take.
But the return of Gordon Kong is a legitimate concern in the UN and NGO community.
I mean, so yeah, they're both legitimate concerns in the sense of they're both nebulous occupying figures. So Gordon Kong is slightly different to Stefan Takker insofar as Stefan Takker is a sort of a mutant invention of the war, right? He is a sellout. He's a Bul Nuer sellout who gains his power because everyone hates him and because he's willing to do whatever the government says. Gordon Kong is a different figure. He served under, guess who, Paulina Matip during the Second Civil War, and effectively ran Koch County as his own personal fiefdom. He was a famous commander. He followed Matip into the SPLA in 2006 and was rewarded with the position of the county commissioner of Koch. So again, one of the interesting things is that he was the ruler of Koch during the Second Civil War as a commander. He then became county commissioner of Koch. Then during the current civil war, he raised Jagai Nur militias from Koch. He was a popular figure to go and fight in Southern Unity during that 2015 campaign and then through to 2018. So, and then he became, of course, so he's gone from being warlord, effectively, like military ruler of Koch, to being county commissioner, to being military ruler, and now he's county commissioner again indicating sort of the broad continuity of these militarized political positions. Except, so he'd been a popular figure in Koch, except now less so. So in 2013, he throws his hat behind Nguyen, right? Like the Bul Nuer's men split. Some of them, the vast majority, join the IO, and Nguyen sees this as an opportunity to get back at Ban Gai, and so joins the government. And Gordon Kong goes with him, and so do the Jagai Nur. The Jagai Nur then serve with the Bul Nuer, and they become what Naomi Pender will call the Nuer of Dinka money, the Nuer who are paid by the government to assault other Nuer. The problem is, for the Jagai Nur, that doesn't give them very much. So while the Bul Nuer take a bunch of cattle, largely which will die in Bentiu, the Jagai Nuer don't get very much apart from earning the enduring enmity of the rest of the Southern Nuer. They're also aware that the fundamental political pact in Bentiu is between the Lake Nur and the Bul Nuer, not the Jagai. So they're increasingly alienated from what's happening in Rubkona, and that results in 2020 and 2021 with the Jagai Nuer going to raid along the Bentiu Road and to raid in Rubkona. This, of course, is hugely embarrassing for Gordon Kong, because Gordon Kong is useful to Nguyen because he controls the Jagai Nuer and because he does what the government says. And so what we've seen this year is under Jagai Jani, who's another Jagai commander, is that Kong's had to go in with the SSPDF to attack his own youth forces and try to retrieve some of the cows that they took in January 2021 from Rubkona County. And so what this has set up is this sort of unfortunate unfolding process by which Gordon Kong has to violently attack his own forces to prove that he controls his own forces, to prove that he is still useful to Nguyen. And I think this will set off a dynamic in Koch about which humanitarians should be rightfully concerned, because it seems to commit them into a further cycle of violence.
So, but how does this all plays out? I mean, if there's incoming violence in Koch, if there's a commissioner in there who is basically an occupying force, if there's a SOA super weak commissioner in Mayandit, if we see this problem in Panijar with the commissioner who has to stay in Juba, so how this plays out in terms of the UNMISS plan of giving back the POC to the government, and that should, you know, encourage returns to their homelands, to Koch, to Mayandit, to Lir, to Panjshir. How will this play out?
I mean, I'm always very reticent to say how it will play out, but it seems what's likely is that there will be cycles of what UNHRD would see as low-level violence in Mayandit, Panjshir, Ler, and Koch, which will displace people, which will push them closer to the main towns, which follows the overall trend of the Second Civil War in general, which is a depopulation of rural environments, and subsequently the minimized capacity to grow food, thus creating more food shortages and more food scarcity. In Unity, increased urbanization. In terms of the POC, I mean, I think that there won't be that much of a consequence right now, simply because there isn't an armed opposition, right? Like there isn't a sort of a formal actor who can violently contest it. Like what the desanctification, as it were, of the POC has created is basically the formalization of the land grab of the Lake and the Bul Nuer, who control Bentiu town, and they've done that through the Ministry of Housing. So, and like the fact that now people have sort of basically had to make their peace with it, because there's no, at least for now, there's no possibility of contesting it. And so what the UN really has done is sign off on a land grab by the government and by what is effectively a military aristocracy. And I think like partly the danger with trying to like think through the consequence and the logic of this situation right now is that there is increased violence. It is about politics. It is about the collapse of the IO. It is about the fact that politics has increasingly become ethnicized and has produced ethnicized violence and political leaders who have used ethnic mobilization to try to make violent claims to both territory and political power, but it doesn't appear as such, right? It appears as raiding, or it appears as Jagai you and youth who are just like uncontrolled. But the reality is it's not about a lack of control. It's like the very logic of government control has produced that raiding. And it's not that like the government needs to come in and police these people. It's the government's police work that's produced the logic of violence and of raiding. And I think that's the logic that will continue inside Unity State in the foreseeable future.
And can I bring in here another player who is another actor in Unity who was at one point very powerful, Matthew Puljang. Then it seemed that he is out of the picture for a while. And then in January, both you and me were quite surprised by the massive reorganization of the SSPDF, which was done in secret at Bilfam headquarters. It was not a publicly announced thing. And Matthew Puljang came back. And that, I think, also connected what you say about the monetization of the economy and an aspect of the South Sudanese economy that most people, I think, do not know or do not care about. But I think it's massively important and interesting. So maybe you can talk about Mayom Kanti and Matthew Puljang's role in his new position.
Yeah, thanks, Ferry. I think that's a really good point. So just for those who don't follow Unity politics with the sad obsession with which me and Ferry do, Matthew Puljang was the figure who was going to be Bul Nuer. It was his militia fundamentally that enabled the government to defend against the IO when the war began. And without Puljang, they probably would have lost Unity and maybe even lost the war. Puljang was paid directly by Kiir. He controlled Mayom. But as the war went on, he's also a Bul Nuer figure. He's also from the same section, but not the same subsection as Nguyen. As the war went on, Puljang, who was also, of course, a deputy of guess who, Bul Nuer. As the war went on, he got older, he got sicker, he had to go to Uganda a lot. And so in 2020, Nguyen, along with the most important Bul Nuer politician in the country that we haven't mentioned yet, who is Tukyugat Luwak, the security advisor of Salva Kiir, schemed. They've been scheming for a while to bring him to Juba, separate him from his forces, and then dismiss him. And so one of the things that happens in Mayom during 2020 is the removal of any figures who threatened the Nguyen Bapin Tukyugat Luwak, like control of power. So if we think about Mayom, Mayom is on the border with Sudan. Mayom is traditionally where, it's of course where Bul Nuer's from, it is where the kingmakers of Unity State politics are from. And partly the reason for that is that it is next to Sudan. And so those men were integrated into SAF, into the Sudan Armed Forces much earlier. There was a lot more military training of the Bul Nuer historically than there was of the Lake Nuer, for instance. I'm talking about the 60s and the 70s. So they gained military power and thus also gained guns much earlier. They were a militarized society much earlier than other Nuer groups, which is partly why the Bul Nuer have this sort of dominant role in unity politics. And so there's always been these contestations about which will be the most powerful Bul Nuer commander. Will it be Peter Gadet or will it be the Bul Nuer? That was one of the great conflicts of 1998 during the Second Civil War, was Kene, Matiep Kene Gadet, the year of the battle of Matiep against Gadet. In this current civil war, the battle has been between Nguyen Montoy and Matthew Puljang, but who will be the figure who will control the Bul Nuer? And the answer is Nguyen Montoy. So they brought Puljang to Juba. They then imprisoned Puljang. And at the same time, they also moved against another figure, who a very popular figure, Stephen Boy. I won't go into too much in detail, but we can in questions, who was the commander of Division 1. They also removed Stephen Boy, another Bul Nuer figure. So after removing these figures, Bapin Montoy then engineers a peace conference in Juba, which has all of the main Bul Nuer luminaries. who are brought together and then made peace. And this peace agreement enables Puljang to be brought back into the fold. But he's brought back into the fold differently. He's no longer a big commander with his own direct line to Kiir. He takes up this interesting role, which is that he is the director of military production for Division 4, Division 4 being the division for Unity State. And these are new figures, which in theory are the figures in control of agricultural production. But what really they are the figures who are responsible for making sure the military gets its side of any land deals that are made with foreign companies. So of course, there have been, like, famously, some of the most famous and dubious deals were the deals made with between Matiep's family and a variety of American mercenaries and sort of happy-go-lucky business people at the end of the Second Civil War. So Puljang has become the figure designed to, one, make sure that the military sort of get their cut in the selling off, any future selling off of Unity lands to foreign companies, and two, the other sort of aspect of military production here is that the figures who are supposedly now in cantonment or in training for this endlessly delayed necessary unified force probably won't create a unified army. That was never really the intention. The idea rather was to sort of press gang, and I use the word intentionally, the IO into wage labor, basically as agricultural laborers producing, agricultural goods for the army. So developing the army as a sort of autonomous resource base. So if that's Puljang's role, the question is what's happened with Mayom County and who has taken over his forces. So after he gets dismissed, there is some raiding in Warrap, there is some disquiet. When Nguyen first comes to Mayom after he dismisses Puljang, people don't even go to meet him. When he goes to Mankien. It's that unpopular a decision. Puljang is a very popular figure. So what we have militarily in Mayom is that Division 4 in the SSPDF reorganization in January doesn't actually get reorganized at all. The figures in control in Unity are not Bul Nuer figures. They are but figures from Barakhazal, which is what's happened often elsewhere in South Sudan, which is that while the leadership of a given state is from its sort of military hierarchy and its political hierarchy, the actual SSPDF figures are figures that are from out of state, because in that way, Kiir hopes to retain some sort of autonomy, military control, and prevent Nguyen simply having all the power in Unity and using that power as a base to challenge Kiir for national politics. So what happened in Mayom is that the military leadership remains, at least in theory, with these out-of-state figures in Bentiu, and their capacity to command what was the Tershwang, the Bul Nuer militias, has not yet been challenged. The actual control of Mayom, the new county commissioner, is, and this is the story of the brothers, the brother of Tukyu Gatluak. So Tukyu Gatluak is the security advisor to Salva Kiir. He is the son of a chief from Mayom County. He spent the Second Civil War as an advisor to Omar al-Bashir and the National Congress Party, coordinating relations between Paulina Matiep and Khartoum. He now basically coordinates relations between the Bul Nuer elite in Bentiu and in Mayom and Salva Kiir. So it's very much plus ça change, plus ça reste la même. He now does mediation between the capital and the Bul Nuer, except the capital in question has changed. His brother is a military figure, slightly, as it was somewhat a military figure, who basically consecrates the control of Tukyu Gatluak in Mayom. He's also a very popular figure, largely because he gives out enormous sums of money, because he's got a large amount of money from his brother controlling the SSR process in Juba. So he's also a way of buying popularity for Nguyen in a somewhat restive Mayom after Puljang was dismissed. So what we have basically is that the story of politics in Unity is the story of these three sets of brothers. Tukyu and Menime, Nguyen and Bapin Montoy, and Lor Lam and Tortungwar. And through understanding these three figures, I think really you can understand not just the politics of Unity State, but the politics of how this emergent class of military and political leaders has come to control politics and the economy in South Sudan.
One amazing fact, that both of these brothers are from families of chiefs. So that also
Yes.
shows of like, you know, how they build up this possibility of become who they are, is that their background is like basically government appointed chiefs.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, right, absolutely. Like, it's a really interesting one that these chiefdoms are positions that are largely enabled by the British, right? Like under the British, they become really like aristocratic, like inherited positions. That like customary authority is used to become powerful figures who raid. That raiding authority is turned into military authority, and that military authority now spans both politics and the military, right? I mean, that just that sort of like basic, almost like that mutation of what customary authority is in all these ways is really, really interesting.
Just, we have only 5 minutes left before we open up for the Q&A. So just before we wrap up, there's one figure you talk a lot about that is of course Taban Dengai. And you know, if you look at the politics of South Sudan on the surface, he is a vice president. He made his pact with Salva Kiir. He's still in power. You know, he made a good deal, no? And then seemingly from your presentation, it seems that he is losing his power in Unity State. So what is his role in this whole thing, and does he have a role at all in what's going on in Unity State?
So Taban Dengai is a fascinating figure because he is someone who at the one level has rode the waves of the formal constraints of the peace agreement and the concerns of the international community into power. So like, to be sort of quick about it, he's never been a popular figure in Unity. He wasn't a popular governor. He's alternately chopped and changed sides between supporting Khartoum and supporting the SPLA, and then when in power between when he was a governor between 2005 2012 between Machar and Kiir. Then in 2016 rather, when Machar flees Juba, he sees an opening. There needs to be some sort of commander of the IO in Juba so that Kiir can tell the international community that there's still a peace agreement. And basically Taban Dengai goes, hey, that can be me. You know, and State Department says, well, you know, we need someone. We might as well try this guy, even though he has no constituency on the ground at all. He then spends the next couple of years trying to build that constituency violently, basically trying to sort of kill people into submission, into acknowledging him as the head of an opposition. That opposition is an entire fiction. It's an fiction created by the peace process so that the international community can pretend that there is a peace process. But eventually, of course, it collapses, right? Like, we have to acknowledge that there is no IO Taban Dengai. There are just Taban Dengai's friends. They don't really constitute like a substantive opposition at all. And then by the time that Machar finally returns to Juba, Machar basically becomes Taban Dengai insofar as the cost of coming back to Juba is that it's a negotiated surrender in which he cannot challenge the government on the ground. Indeed, he immediately unifies with the government and goes and attacks NAS in Equatoria. His commanders on the ground who pose any sort of real threat to the government are attacked, split off from him. They join the government in their own right, or they abandon him. And so Machar basically becomes Taban Dengai. And if Machar becomes Taban Dengai, then what is the point of a Taban Dengai? There is basically no point. He's a zombie. He is kept alive artificially by the logic of the peace agreement because he now has a faction and he now somehow counts for something, but he counts for nothing. He's one of these figures that, because of sort of the architecture of the international peace agreements, is so interested in like factions, as if factions had some real meaning, as if they mapped onto like actual cleavages in South Sudan. He's kept alive by that very process. He is a vice president, and of course he's a very rich guy, but he has no bargaining power to gain a position. So you see that in the cabinet, there are no figures from Taban Dengai's grouping. And I mean the cabinet of the nation, not just of Unity. And in Unity, there are no figures from Taban Dengai. So, of course, then, like any zombie, he can come back, right? He might be armless and legless, But if it was the case, I don't know, that for some reason Machar left the government, and we once again needed a fake opposition, then along would come Taban Dengai, legless and armless, stumping along, becoming once again a useful figure for Kiir. But without something like that happening, there is no chance of Taban Dengai returning to unity state politics in the near future.
But it's also good to have a very weak vice president if you have to bring in someone, let's say from Soma or anyone, to the government. You can offer a vice presidency, you can change Taban Dengai, you can give some position to Taban Dengai. He has to accept because he has nowhere else to go. And then you have another position that you can, negotiate with people. No?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That one of the things that we see with both Kiir and Machar's appointments in general is that they often appoint instrumentally weak figures, right? Like I think the politics of appointments in South Sudan in general walks this really delicate calculus. On the one hand, you want to appoint people that you can easily control, and so ideally don't have too much power on the ground. On the other hand, sometimes it's necessary to appoint a figure who appeases folks on the ground so they don't go into open rebellion or choose to back someone else. And I think you see that really clearly in the politics of unity state. In a place like Lair, where the people on the ground would never back a government candidate anyway, because this is the heartland of the IO, you have to basically appoint a figure who is really weak, who is an imposing force, who can't gain power from the opposition constituency on the ground. So stiff and tackle. In a place like Gwit, it's much more important to appoint a figure who's popular, so that Taban Dengai can't try to come in and mobilize the people of Gwit against you. And so you need to find some way of keeping the Jakan on side, and so appoint a relatively popular figure. And I think that sort of the calculus of popular constituency is a really important way of understanding the politics of South Sudan more generally right now.
So then, before we open the floor, any advice to make it a bit more practical for the audience? Any advice for humanitarians or anyone working in Unity State that you can share with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think not to sort of toot the map, but when one is engaging with a figure, it is important to understand who the figure is, and that's not given by their ministerial position. And I guess that should be obvious, but I've been surprised in Bentiu, not to mention Mayom, the degree to which humanitarians will have a meeting with the Minister for Labor, and all they know about them is that they're the Minister for Labor. And that, of course, is not a meaningful position, because there isn't meaningful labor legislation in Unity State. What's meaningful about that position is the place it plays in this delicate calculus of ethnic and power politics. So why would that be meaningful? Well, for me, it's meaningful, for instance, to know that the head of the police, John Bul Nuer, is the man who displaced the population into the POC. I think that just in terms of doing HLP, in terms of thinking about housing issues, that seems to be something that one would want to bear in mind, right? And one would want to bear in mind who the new commissioners are in terms of understanding what type of activities one should do. I think the other thing that is important about understanding who the individuals involved are is understanding the place that one plays in the political economy of the country. So, for instance, who are you renting a compound from? Do you know the answer to that? Do you know, if you think about your sunk costs in a given county or in a given state, how much of that money is going to Nguyen Mon Toi? I think, and you can literally find the answer to that out, right? What's happened since 2013 is that Nguyen has slowly bought up through businesses and through basically fake individuals much of Bentiu. Nguyen probably owns what, 60% of Bentiu? So via various shell companies and shell figures, how much of you, how many NGOs are just paying money, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, directly to Nguyen Mon Toi, directly to the guy whose forces have raped and killed their way through Southern Unity 5 times in the last 5 years. So then, the question would be, well, can we find somewhere else to maybe rent a compound? Right? To what degree are we complicit in this? And I think the degree to which one understands one's complicity is by actually understanding the situation. And one does that by understanding the figures with which one is embedded economically and politically in unity state. And one of the great tools for doing that is the map that Small Arms Survey has made.
Thanks, Joshua. I think I pass it back to Christopher to open up for Q&A. And just to, I don't know if it was mentioned or not, but the presentation was recorded, but the Q&A will not be recorded. It's a Chatham House rules, so be open. It's among us.